ever been on a trip to a totally new and unfamiliar location? I love to travel and explore, but sometimes even the most beautiful places in the world can be hard to navigate unless you're a local. When you're surrounded by unfamiliar sights and sounds and settings, there can be comfort in coming across something or someone familiar. When I'm traveling, I love to look for these little nuggets that remind me of home. Hearing my favorite song at a coffee shop, visiting a restaurant that makes my go-to meal, or spotting someone wearing my team's jersey. All these little interactions give me a sense of belonging, even when I'm away from home. I'm Tatum, and something I've learned is that even when we're not exploring new places, we're constantly looking for ways to fit in. It's comforting to feel like we belong by being connected to those around us. But it's not always easy. Have you ever struggled to find common ground with people at your school, church, or even within your own family? You can feel like an outsider among the people you're supposed to be closest to. When you feel disconnected from the world around you, it's tempting to either change yourself to blend in or give up on belonging altogether. And even if you have a gut feeling that those aren't ideal choices, you might not know what else to do. So you're stuck, wondering, where do I belong? If this question has ever crossed your mind, you're not the only one. People have been looking for a place to belong since the beginning of time. When we look at the life of Jesus, we see someone who was distinct. He was different from everyone else around him, and yet deeply engaged with the people and culture of his day. Jesus is God's son, and he came to earth with this incredible mission and purpose. At Easter, Christians celebrate the truth of his death and resurrection. Yeah, he actually came back from the dead. But why? And what does that have to do with us feeling like we belong? Let's take a deeper look at the crucifixion and resurrection of Jesus to help us answer some of these questions. First, a little context. At this point in the story, Jesus had been betrayed by one of his closest friends. This led to him being unfairly convicted as a criminal and sentenced to death through a horrific process called crucifixion. Mark chapter 15 describes Jesus enduring this painful punishment. We're going to pick up in verse 33 after Jesus had been tortured and nailed to a cross. Mark wrote, "When it was noon, darkness came over the whole land until 3 p.m. And at 3, Jesus cried out with a loud voice, 'Eloi, Eloi, lama sabachthani,' which is translated, my God, why have you abandoned me?" Can you sense the intensity of this moment? Mark wrote that as Jesus was dying, the entire sky went dark. In the Bible, God often used nature to communicate something bigger. When the sky went dark in the middle of the day, God's anger and devastation were reflected in his creation. His son was being tormented, and it caused him grief. Now, hearing this might be confusing. I mean, Jesus changed lives, healed people, and performed amazing miracles. How did he end up on a cross, dying this horrible death? Because Jesus is God the Son, he had all the same power as God the Father. But because Jesus loves his people, he chose to give up his life and take on the punishment for our sin. You see, sin is choosing to do what we think is best instead of following what God says is best. This demands a payment, and that payment is death. But instead of us paying that, Jesus stepped in. He died as the payment for our sin, and he did this willingly. Let's keep reading. Jesus let out a loud cry and breathed his last. Then the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. When the centurion, who was standing opposite him, saw the way he breathed his last, he said, "Truly, this man was the Son of God." Jesus died. His body hung on the cross, beaten, bruised, and empty. Hearing this, we may think that Jesus had truly been abandoned. But did you catch what happened down the road right after Jesus died? This curtain tore. Okay, so what's happening here? Why the scene swipe to a temple curtain after Jesus just died? What you need to know is that the temple was the place people went to meet with God, and this temple curtain was the barrier that separated God's people from his presence. Only priests could go in, and only after a long process. And this curtain was huge. I'm not talking about dainty ones you hang in your bedroom. I'm talking almost 100 feet high. When the curtain ripped, it meant that there were no longer any barriers between God and his people. Jesus' death gave us full access to God, and this access is available to everyone. One of the Roman soldiers who watched Jesus die saw what the crowds didn't. He realized that the man who had set himself apart for such a painful death had to be the true Son of God. Jesus really, physically died that day. His body was put into a tomb, and a few days later, some of his followers went to the tomb. Let's pick up in Mark 16, verse 4. Looking up, they noticed that the stone, which was very large, had been rolled away. When they entered the tomb, they saw a young man dressed in a white robe sitting on the right side. They were alarmed. "Don't be alarmed," he told them. "You are looking for Jesus of Nazareth, who was crucified. He has risen. He is not here. See the place where they put him." Before he died, Jesus plainly told his disciples that he would die and would rise again. While many of Jesus' friends and followers loved him, they had a hard time believing that this would be the plan. So when Jesus rose from the dead on the third day after his crucifixion, their world was turned upside down. On the cross, Jesus took what we deserved, separation from God, and gave us what we couldn't get on our own, forgiveness. Because he has given us his right standing before God, we get to belong. If you choose to trust Jesus, you're welcomed into God's family and offered a life filled with purpose and hope. This Easter, we can remember that our place on this earth is only temporary, kind of like a long trip out of town. And sometimes we'll sense that we don't belong here. But if you're a follower of Jesus, you've been given lasting belonging, a family, and an identity that can't be shaken. And when you have that, you can't help but live distinctly different than how you did before.